For decades, fans of Little House on the Prairie believed the cast was as warm and loving off-screen as it appeared on television. Melissa Sue Anderson and Karen Grassle became household names, forever linked by a show that defined family, innocence, and moral strength. But behind the smiles, shared scenes, and nostalgic memories, there was a tension few ever dared to discuss until now. At 63, Melissa Sue Anderson has finally chosen to speak up, and what she reveals quietly dismantles years of carefully preserved illusion. Her words aren't loud or cruel, but they are honest, and honesty, after all these years, hits harder than gossip ever could. While fans assumed lifelong friendship, Melissa's perspective suggests something far more complicated, shaped by unspoken feelings, professional pressure, and emotional distance that grew over time. The truth isn't about hatred or scandal. It's about two very different women navigating fame, expectations, and identity while millions watched and judged their every move. What went unsaid during those years slowly became heavier than what was ever spoken aloud. For decades, Melissa remained silent out of respect, restraint, and perhaps self-protection. But time has a way of loosening old knots. Now, as she looks back on her life and career, she's finally ready to clarify what really existed between her and Karen Grassle, and why the story fans believed was never the full truth. For years, Melissa Sue Anderson was known simply as Mary Ingalls, the quiet, disciplined daughter whose strength and vulnerability left a lasting mark on television history. But behind that familiar image was a young actress navigating fame at an age when most people are still discovering who they are. At just 11 years old, Melissa stepped into a world of adult expectations, professional pressure, and emotional complexity that few truly understood. On Little House on the Prairie, Karen Grassle played Carolyn Ingalls, the warm and nurturing mother figure audiences adored. On screen, the bond between mother and daughter felt authentic, gentle, and deeply emotional. Viewers assumed that closeness extended beyond the cameras. But as Melissa later reflected, the reality of working relationships, especially in high-pressure environments, was rarely so simple. Melissa has never framed her experience in terms of bitterness or blame. Instead, she describes it as a quiet emotional distance that developed over time. As a child actor, she often felt the weight of expectation more than the comfort of guidance. The set was professional, structured, and demanding. And while many adults around her were kind, there was little room for vulnerability. For Melissa, the absence of a deeper personal connection was something she felt keenly, even if she didn't fully understand it at the time. Karen Grassle, already an accomplished stage actress, approached the role with seriousness and discipline. From Melissa's perspective, that professionalism sometimes translated into emotional reserve. There were no dramatic confrontations, no explosive arguments, just a sense that warmth on screen did not always carry over when the cameras stopped rolling. As a young girl, Melissa internalized that difference, unsure whether it was intentional or simply the nature of adult work environments. What made the experience more complex was the public's perception. Fans often expected the cast to mirror their characters in real life, placing emotional expectations on relationships that were, at their core, professional. Melissa learned early that public narratives rarely leave space for nuance. If she appeared distant or reserved, it was often misinterpreted, reinforcing the idea that everyone else was warm and open while she was somehow difficult or aloof. Over time, this dynamic shaped how Melissa viewed herself. She became guarded, introspective, and deeply private. Rather than speaking up, she learned to remain quiet, to observe, endure, and move forward. That silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. As a child growing up under constant scrutiny, discretion became her shield. Looking back now, Melissa understands that both she and Karen were navigating very different pressures. Karen was an adult performer balancing artistic standards and personal expectations. Melissa was a child trying to make sense of a world that rarely slowed down for her emotions. The disconnect wasn't rooted in malice, but in circumstance, perspective, and unspoken needs that were never fully addressed. What Melissa emphasizes today is not conflict, but contrast. Two people sharing a meaningful project, yet experiencing it in profoundly different ways. The warmth viewers felt was real, but it belonged to the story, not necessarily to the off-screen relationship. And for a young actress still finding her voice, That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Reveals the foundation of Melissa Sue Anderson's long-held silence. Not a feud, not resentment, but a quiet understanding that sometimes, even in beloved stories, emotional distance exists where audiences least expected. As the years passed and Little House on the Prairie faded into nostalgia, Melissa Sue Anderson carried the experience with her in quiet ways. Unlike many former child stars, she didn't rush toward reinvention or public reinvention. Instead, she stepped back, choosing a life that offered distance from the expectations that had shaped her youth. With that distance came perspective, and with perspective came clarity about what she had truly felt all those years ago. Time softened some memories but sharpened others. Melissa began to understand that what she once perceived as personal rejection was, in many ways, a reflection of circumstance. Grassle was navigating her own pressures, being a central figure on a wildly popular show, maintaining professional standards and embodying a maternal ideal that millions scrutinized weekly. That responsibility didn't leave much emotional space for nurturing a real-life child co-star in the way audiences imagined. Still, understanding did not erase impact. Melissa admits that as a young actress, she often longed for reassurance, small gestures of warmth or validation that might have helped her feel less alone. When those moments didn't come, she internalized the absence. She learned early to rely on herself, to suppress disappointment, and to keep her emotions carefully contained. That self-reliance became a defining trait, but it also came at a cost. As an adult, Melissa reflected on how silence shaped her identity. For years, she avoided discussing her experiences publicly. Not because she feared controversy, but because she didn't yet have the language to describe something so subtle. There was no dramatic incident to point to, only a feeling, persistent and formative, that something essential had been missing. Speaking about it prematurely, she felt, would have invited misunderstanding. Distance from Hollywood allowed Melissa to reevaluate her past without the noise of fan expectations. Away from conventions, interviews, and nostalgia-driven narratives, she could finally ask herself difficult questions. What had she needed back then? What had she assumed about others that might not have been true? And perhaps most importantly, why had she felt responsible for maintaining a public illusion that didn't reflect her private reality? With maturity came empathy. Melissa began to see Grassle not as a distant figure from her childhood, but as a woman shaped by her own history, ambitions, and limitations. She recognized that adults often fail children not out of cruelty, but out of distraction, exhaustion, or unexamined habits. This realization didn't excuse the emotional gap, but it reframed it. The story was no longer about fault. It was about impact. What finally allowed Melissa to speak was a sense of emotional safety she had never felt before. She was no longer the child actor expected to be grateful, agreeable, and silent. She was a woman who had lived, reflected, and healed enough to trust her own voice. Speaking now wasn't about correcting the past, it was about honoring her truth without diminishing anyone else's. Melissa's decision to speak up was also driven by a broader awareness of how child actors are perceived. She knew her experience wasn't unique. Many young performers grow up surrounded by adults who are kind but emotionally unavailable, professional but distant. By sharing her story, Melissa hoped to validate those quiet experiences, the ones that don't make headlines but leave lasting impressions. Reveals that Melissa Sue Anderson's words are not an accusation, but a reflection. They emerge from years of introspection, empathy, and growth. Her voice, once cautious and restrained, now carries calm clarity. She speaks not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge them, and in doing so, finally releases the silence that shaped her for so long. For decades. The public narrative surrounding Little House on the Prairie was simple and comforting. Fans believed the cast shared the same warmth off-screen that they portrayed on it. The idea was reassuring, almost necessary, for a show built on family values and emotional sincerity. But as Melissa Sue Anderson slowly came to understand, public narratives often leave no room for complexity. And real human relationships rarely fit into such neat shapes. One of the hardest parts for Melissa was realizing how firmly those assumptions had settled in the public imagination. Any suggestion that things were more complicated was often met with resistance. Fans didn't want nuance. They wanted reassurance that their cherished memories were untouched. That expectation created an unspoken pressure to remain silent, to protect an image that had never fully reflected her lived experience. Melissa emphasizes that her story does not cancel Karen Grassle's truth. In fact, she acknowledges that Karen has spoken openly about her own struggles during those years, her ambitions, frustrations, and the challenges of being a woman navigating a demanding industry. From Karen's perspective, professionalism was survival. Emotional restraint was a tool, not a weapon. Two people can share the same environment and experience it in fundamentally different ways. And neither perspective is wrong. What Melissa came to understand is that her younger self needed something Karen may not have known how or been able to give. The absence of warmth was not necessarily a deliberate choice. It was the result of mismatched needs and unspoken expectations. As a child, Melissa lacked the framework to articulate that longing. As an adult, she finally recognizes it for what it was, a quiet, emotional gap, not a personal failure. Public misconceptions often painted Melissa as distant or aloof, a label that followed her long after the show ended. What few people realized was that her reserve was learned behavior. On a set where emotions were carefully controlled and professionalism was paramount, she adapted by withdrawing inward. Silence became safety. Privacy became protection. Those traits stayed with her into adulthood, shaping both her career choices and her personal life. Karen Grassle, on the other hand, carried the weight of embodying an idealized mother figure for millions. That role came with immense responsibility and scrutiny. Maintaining boundaries was not just a preference, it was a necessity. In hindsight, Melissa sees how those boundaries, while functional for Karen, unintentionally created distance for a child who was still searching for reassurance. The most important realization for Melissa was that truth does not require villains. The story between her and Karen is not one of betrayal or hostility, but of parallel lives moving alongside each other without fully intersecting. It is a reminder that kindness can exist alongside emotional absence, and that professionalism can sometimes eclipse intimacy. By speaking now, Melissa isn't asking audiences to rewrite their memories. She isn't dismantling the legacy of Little House on the Prairie. Instead, she is adding depth to it. She's reminding fans that the beauty of the show came from performance, not from perfect harmony behind the scenes. And that acknowledging complexity does not diminish love, it enriches understanding. What Melissa hopes people take away is permission for former child actors to speak honestly without being accused of ingratitude. Permission for fans to hold two truths at once, that a show can be deeply meaningful, and that the people who made it were imperfect humans navigating difficult circumstances. Is where clarity replaces confusion. Melissa Sue Anderson's voice is steady, reflective, and free of resentment. She no longer seeks validation from public opinion. Her truth stands on its own quiet, nuanced, and deeply human. It is not an ending, but a reconciliation with the past that allows her to move forward without carrying silence as a burden. The distance between memory and peace is often filled with understanding. And for Melissa Sue Anderson, that understanding arrives slowly. Looking back now, she no longer views her experience through the lens of hurt alone. Time has softened the edges, allowing compassion to replace confusion. What once felt like rejection now feels more like a missed connection, two people doing their best inside. A system that rarely paused to consider emotional needs, especially those of a child. Melissa is careful with her words when she speaks today. There is no bitterness in her tone, no desire to provoke or revise history. Instead, there is calm acceptance. She acknowledges that Karen Grassle may never have known the impact of her emotional reserve, and that realization matters. Harm does not always require intent. Sometimes it is born from silence, from unspoken expectations, from the quiet assumption that children are resilient enough to endure anything placed before them. Forgiveness, for Melissa, was not about receiving an apology. It was about releasing herself from the weight of unresolved feelings she carried for decades. She no longer needs validation from the past. She understands that both she and Karen were shaped by forces larger than either of them: fame, pressure, gender expectations, and a television industry that valued performance over emotional care. What Melissa hopes fans understand now is simple but profound. The magic of Little House on the Prairie came from storytelling, not from perfection behind the scenes. The warmth audiences felt was real, but it was crafted. That does not make it false, it makes it art. Recognizing that distinction allows space for honesty, without destroying the legacy so many people cherish. She also wants Karen Grassle to be seen fairly. Melissa does not paint her as cold or unkind. She sees her as a professional woman navigating her own struggles in an unforgiving industry. Two truths can exist at once. Karen did her job well, and Melissa felt emotionally alone at times. Acknowledging one does not erase the other. Speaking up at 63 is not about reopening old wounds, it is about closure. Melissa is finally at a point in her life where she can tell her story without fear of being misunderstood. She's no longer the quiet child on set, nor the guarded young woman avoiding difficult conversations. She is someone who has lived long enough to trust her perspective and share it with grace. There is peace in that honesty. Melissa no longer carries the burden of protecting an illusion that never belonged to her. By telling her truth, she reclaims a part of herself that learned too early to stay silent. And in doing so, she offers something valuable to others, especially those who grew up in similar circumstances, feeling unseen while being watched by millions. This is not a story about conflict. It is a story about growth, about recognizing that emotional distance can exist even in beloved places, and that healing does not require blame. Melissa Sue Anderson's voice today is steady, reflective, and free. She has made peace with her past not by rewriting it, but by finally allowing herself to speak it aloud. In the end, what she wants most is understanding, not judgment, not sides, not outrage. Just the acceptance that behind every cherished story are real people, each carrying their own truths. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is speak gently about what was missing, and then let it go.